The moon hung low in the sky, casting its silver glow over the quiet streets of Westwood Estates. The upscale neighborhood was tranquil at this late hour, its manicured lawns and stately homes resting under the soft hum of streetlights. Ethan Parker's sleek black sedan glided smoothly down Ridgewood Drive, the muted sounds of jazz filling the car. Ethan and Marcus Bennett, colleagues and friends for years, were heading home after an exhausting evening spent networking at a high-profile business gala. The event had been a success. Both men agreed. It wasn't every day that you sealed a deal with high-ranking investors while enjoying hors d'oeuvres under the glittering chandeliers of a grand hotel. Yet the night had been long. And now, in the quiet comfort of the car, they allowed themselves a moment to unwind. That felt like the longest night ever, Marcus remarked, rubbing his temples as he leaned back in the passenger seat. His voice carried the fatigue of hours spent smiling and shaking hands. Ethan chuckled, keeping his eyes on the road. Networking always takes it out of you, but it's worth it when the payoff is this good. The deal we locked in tonight? Game changer. Marcus nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. We've worked too hard for this not to be. It's about time things started clicking into place. They had every reason to feel accomplished. Ethan, a seasoned FBI agent, and Marcus, his trusted partner, had built their reputations on grit, intelligence, and integrity. Their careers were a testament to years of unyielding dedication. And tonight's milestone was yet another step forward. But for all their successes, both men knew the world they operated in wasn't always fair, and not all victories were celebrated equally. The city seemed to mirror their sense of peace as the sedan cruised through Westwood Estates. The streets were unusually empty, the houses dark save for the occasional porch light left on to ward off the night. It wasn't until Ethan made a right turn on a Birchwood Avenue that a flicker of blue light in his rearview mirror shattered the calm. Marcus noticed it too, shifting in his seat as the faint glow grew more insistent. "You think they're after someone else?" he asked, though the unease in his voice betrayed his hope. The question was answered almost immediately when the siren blared, and the cruiser's lights flashed more aggressively. Ethan sighed, his fingers tightening slightly on the wheel as he pulled over to the side of the road. "Guess not," Ethan muttered, throwing Marcus a look of mild irritation tempered by an all-too-familiar resignation. This wasn't their first time being stopped, and both men knew the routine all too well. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser. The taller one, Officer Carter, adjusted his belt as he approached Ethan's side of the car. His junior partner, Officer Davis, moved toward Marcus's side, his expression cold and guarded. The dynamic between the two officers was immediately apparent. Carter carried himself with the assertiveness of someone accustomed to being in charge, while Davis exuded a quiet unease that was harder to read. Ethan rolled down the window, his movements slow and deliberate, as the night air crept into the car. "Good evening, officers. Is there a problem?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Carter's gaze swept over Ethan and Marcus, his expression impassive but his eyes lingering just a second too long. "License and registration," he demanded curtly. Ignoring the question, Ethan complied, reaching into the glove compartment for his documents. His FBI badge, tucked neatly alongside his driver's license, was a silent testament to his authority. But he knew better than to lead with it. Handing over the papers, he offered a polite, "Here you go." Carter took the documents without a word, flipping through them with a dismissive air before glancing back at Ethan. "Step out of the vehicle," he said abruptly. Ethan frowned, confused. "Is there something wrong? I provided everything you asked for." Carter's eyes narrowed, his hand moving instinctively toward the holster at his hip. "You're acting suspicious," he replied, his tone growing sharper. Beside him, Marcus bristled. "Suspicious? For what?" "We've done nothing wrong," he interjected, his voice steady but tinged with irritation. Davis shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between Carter and the two men. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to break. "Step out of the vehicle," Carter repeated, his voice hardening. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. Ethan exhaled slowly, his frustration evident but controlled. He unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping into the cool night air with his hands visible. Marcus followed suit, though his clenched jaw and tense shoulders betrayed his growing anger. As they stood by the car, the cruiser's headlights casting long shadows on the asphalt, Carter and Davis circled the vehicle like predators sizing up their prey. To any passing observer, it might have seemed like a routine stop, but for Ethan and Marcus, it was something far more insidious. They had been in situations like this before, where authority met bias, and professionalism was overshadowed by prejudice. "I'm going to need you both to put your hands on the hood," Carter ordered, his hand resting firmly on his gun. Ethan shot Marcus a warning glance, as if to say, "Don't escalate this." Reluctantly, they complied, placing their hands on the cold metal. The indignity of the moment sank deep into their bones. But they knew the cost of resistance wasn't worth the risk. Davis moved in to pat them down, his hands rough and his demeanor void of any attempt to mask the disdain in his actions. Carter, meanwhile, radioed for backup, his voice a mixture of authority and something darker, almost as if he relished the power he held over the situation. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Ethan's mind raced, his FBI training kicking in. He knew better than to lose his composure, but he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was about control, about power, and he and Marcus had been caught in the crosshairs. As Davis finished his search, Carter finally looked at Ethan's badge with more care. His expression shifted slightly, the faintest flicker of recognition crossing his face. But the damage was already done, and Ethan knew it. This wasn't just about him or Marcus. This was about something bigger, something systemic. Ethan straightened, his hand still on the hood, but his posture now commanding. "I'd like to speak with your superior," he said, his voice calm but firm. Carter hesitated, glancing at Davis. For the first time, doubt crept into his eyes. But before he could respond, the sound of another vehicle approaching broke the tension. A second police car pulled up, its lights cutting through the night, and out stepped Sergeant Emily Taylor. Ethan's eyes met Marcus's, and in that silent exchange, a glimmer of hope flickered. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sergeant Emily Taylor stepped out of her cruiser with the quiet authority of someone who had seen it all. Her sharp gaze swept over the scene. Two black men, hands on the hood of a car, and two officers, one visibly tense, the other radiating smug authority. Her instincts told her something wasn't right. "Officer Carter, what's going on here?" she asked, her tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of scrutiny. Carter stiffened, his face a mask of composure. "Routine traffic stop. Sergeant, these two were acting suspiciously, so we pulled them over to check things out." "Suspicious how?" Taylor pressed, crossing her arms as she moved closer. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. Carter hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. "They seem nervous. We're just ensuring everything is in order." Taylor shifted her gaze to Ethan and Marcus. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone lighter but still probing. Ethan turned his head slightly, careful to keep his hands on the hood as he spoke. "Sergeant, my partner and I are FBI agents. We were heading home after a work event when they stopped us. We've complied with every request. Yet here we are." Taylor's expression didn't change, but her eyebrows raised slightly. She turned back to Carter. "FBI? Huh? Did you check their identification?" "Yes, ma'am," Carter replied quickly, holding up Ethan's documents. "It looks legitimate, but we're being thorough. Can't be too careful." Taylor took the papers from Carter, inspecting them closely under the glow of the cruiser's lights. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she recognized the credentials. "Ethan Parker and Marcus Bennett," she read aloud, "senior agents with the FBI." Her gaze shifted to Carter, her tone sharpening. "And you're treating them like this, why?" Carter's jaw tightened, but he offered no response. Taylor's eyes narrowed as she handed the documents back to Ethan. "You can lower your hands. Gentlemen," she said firmly, This doesn't look like a situation that warrants the treatment you've received. Ethan and Marcus slowly lowered their hands. Their movements careful but precise. Ethan's face remained composed, but Marcus's jaw clenched visibly, his frustration barely contained. He straightened his posture, his hands brushing against the front of his jacket as he exhaled sharply. "Thank you, Sergeant," Ethan said, his tone even. "We appreciate your intervention." Taylor nodded before turning her attention back to Carter and Davis. "Explain yourselves," she demanded, her voice low but authoritative. "What exactly did you think these men were guilty of?" Carter opened his mouth to speak, but Taylor cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Before you say anything, let me make one thing clear. This is not how we operate. We don't profile, and we don't treat people, especially fellow officers, with anything less than respect." Davis shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Carter and Taylor. He looked like a man caught in a storm he hadn't expected. "Sergeant, we were just following procedure," he stammered. "We didn't mean any disrespect." Taylor's eyes narrowed further. "Procedure doesn't include harassment," she snapped. "These are FBI agents. How did you not realize that from the start?" Carter bristled, his pride keeping him from admitting fault. "They didn't announce it immediately. We were doing our due diligence." Taylor shook her head, her frustration evident. "Due diligence doesn't look like this. You escalated a situation that should have been routine. This stops now." Ethan took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Sergeant Taylor, I understand you're trying to manage this, but I'm not letting this slide. My partner and I complied fully, and yet we were treated as criminals. We're both senior agents, and our credentials were ignored. This isn't about a misunderstanding, it's about bias." Taylor looked at Ethan, her expression softening slightly. "I hear you, Agent Parker, and I'll make sure this is addressed." Marcus, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke, his voice tinged with anger. "Addressing it isn't enough. What if we weren't FBI? What if we were just two regular men trying to get home? How far would this have gone?" The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Even Davis looked down, shame creeping into his features. Taylor nodded slowly. "You're right, Agent Bennett, and it's not something I take lightly. I'll make sure the report reflects what happened here." Carter's face flushed, a mix of anger and humiliation. He opened his mouth to protest, but Taylor cut him off again. "Enough! Carter, you've done enough tonight." Ethan glanced at Marcus, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Taylor. "Sergeant, thank you for stepping in. We'll be filing a formal complaint, and I trust that you'll support an honest account of what happened." Taylor met his gaze, her voice steady. "You have my word, Agent Parker. This will be addressed at the highest level." The tension began to ease as Taylor stepped back, motioning for Carter and Davis to return to their vehicle. Reluctantly, the two officers complied, their earlier bravado replaced with sullen silence. Ethan and Marcus watched them go, their backs straight, their dignity intact. As Taylor prepared to leave, she looked at Ethan and Marcus one last time. "Be safe out there, and don't let this shake your faith in the system. There are still good people fighting to make it better." Ethan nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We know, Sergeant, but that doesn't make this any less exhausting." Taylor sighed, offering a small, understanding smile. "I get it. Have a good night, agents." With that, she returned to her cruiser, the sound of the engine fading as she drove off into the night. Ethan and Marcus stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling over them like a heavy fog. "This isn't over," Marcus said finally, his voice low but resolute. "No," Ethan agreed, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "But at least we're still standing." The two men climbed back into the sedan, the jazz music resuming as Ethan started the car. As they drove off into the quiet streets, the night felt different, no longer serene, but charged with the promise of a battle yet to come. The drive back to Ethan Parker's house was quieter than it had been the previous night. The soft jazz playing in the background barely masked the weight of the conversation Ethan and Marcus Bennett had just shared with Assistant Director Graves. The memory of the encounter with Officers Carter and Davis lingered like a shadow over both men. But for the first time since it happened, there was a faint sense of hope. Graves had listened intently, her sharp eyes scanning every word of their report. Her reaction had been swift and firm. The incident would be reported to Internal Affairs, and the conduct of both officers thoroughly investigated. This isn't just about accountability, Ethan had said during the meeting. It's about making sure this stops happening, not just to us, but to everyone. Graves had nodded solemnly. I'll push this as far as it can go, but change takes time. Keep pushing. The system needs voices like yours. The words echoed in Ethan's mind as the sedan pulled up to his driveway. Marcus, sitting quietly in the passenger seat, finally broke the silence. You think Graves can actually make a difference? Ethan leaned back in his seat, his hand resting on the steering wheel. I don't know, he admitted. But what's the alternative? Giving up? Staying silent? That's not who we are. Marcus exhaled sharply, his shoulders relaxing slightly. You're right, he said. But damn, it gets exhausting. Ethan smiled faintly. That's why we keep each other going. The two men sat for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle over them. Then Marcus opened the car door and stepped out. I'll see you tomorrow, he said, giving Ethan a small nod. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're the one standing beside me in this. Same here, Ethan replied. Get some rest. Later that evening, Ethan sat on the steps of his home, a cup of coffee in hand, as the last light of the day faded into the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of amber and lavender, the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling around him. The events of the night before felt distant now, though the lessons they carried were still fresh. Marcus had been right, it was exhausting, fighting battles like these. But Ethan knew they couldn't stop. The system needed people willing to stand up, to push for accountability and fairness. If they gave up, the Carters and Devises of the world would keep winning, unchecked. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Ethan found himself thinking about Sergeant Taylor. She had stepped in when it mattered, using her position to de-escalate and restore a semblance of balance. It was a reminder that there were still good people in the system, fighting the same fight from within. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up. Marcus stepped out, holding a six-pack of soda and a grin that was equal parts tired and amused. Figured you could use some company, he said, walking up to the steps. Ethan chuckled, scooting over to make room. Always, he said. The two men sat in companionable silence, the distant glow of city lights reflecting in their eyes. They didn't need to say much. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. The road ahead would be long, but neither of them was walking it alone. For Ethan and Marcus, the fight wasn't over. But tonight, under the quiet sky, they allowed themselves a moment to breathe. They had each other, their mission, and the knowledge that every small step toward justice mattered. And that was enough to keep them moving forward.